Thank you very much, Sunita. That bit about short-termism was much better than anything that's in my presentation, so I should quit while I'm ahead. So yeah, it's a little disconcerting to come and be asked to present a masterclass, because I'm not sure there's going to be a whole lot that's masterful about this, and I don't know how class-like it will be. I have a geography degree, as Sunita's mentioned, so I have no formal training whatsoever in marketing. For most of my career, I've worked in the US and that country formerly known as the United Kingdom. So what would I possibly know about Australians? My career's been spent working entirely for advertising agencies, so your procurement colleagues will tell you I'm not to be trusted. And as you can see, I'm also a member of an older demographic, so I'm completely out of touch with everything useful that's going on in the business. But despite that scandalous lack of qualifications, I hope you'll be prepared to listen to some of the things I have to say about the worlds of marketing communications and strategy. And in particular, I'm going to touch on a few things that are upsetting me and have been upsetting me for a while, that I think probably get in the way of all of us doing a good job. And which, in my humble opinion, we probably need to fix. So more than 20 years ago, I was invited to a breakfast in New York by a man named Andrew Jaffe. Andrew Jaffe, at the time, was editor of Adweek magazine. And to be honest, I had absolutely no idea why he'd invited me to breakfast. It came completely out of the blue. And I arrived at breakfast, and there sitting with him at the table was an editor from John Wiley & Sons, and I had no idea why they were there either, but we had a very nice chat and a bowl of berries. And then at some point during the breakfast, Andrew sort of leaned meaningfully over his Eggs Benedict and said to me in profound tones, "John, America needs a book about account planning." And he paused for dramatic effect, and I said something about America needing a book about account planning like it needed an Ebola outbreak. And he didn't crack a smile. Now, I don't know whether he wasn't familiar with the virus or whether, like most Americans, it was probably that he just wasn't familiar with British humour. But anyway, he just looked at me for a moment, then carried on with what he was saying about America needing a book about account planning. And at the time, I was much more interested in practicing planning than I was writing about it. But a few conversations later, about 3 months later, I succumbed and said, yeah, I'll write the book. Now, at this point, I should say, I'm not trying to pitch my book. I'm not a great lover of business books. And actually, if I hadn't written this, I wouldn't have read it. And I say that in all honesty. I'd have no interest. And Adam Morgan is one of my best friends. He's written about 4 books. I've never read any of them. I told him I read the first one. So when he comes, don't tell him I said that. But I don't read business books for reasons that I'll talk about later. Anyway, I digress. So 1998, Truth, Lies and Advertising was published. It had been 30 years since Stephen King, and I don't want you to get the idea that it was Stephen King, the horror writer, who started planning at JWT. It was another Stephen King, and Stanley Pollitt started it at BMP. And forgive this terrible blurry picture. One of my ambitions in life is not to be remembered one day by a sort of blurry, crappy picture. You know, you should always have good pictures on your social media profile in case something terrible happens and you appear on global news. Anyway, Stephen King didn't listen to that, but he wrote of how creative imagination subjected to critical control is essential to the creation of effective communications. Stanley Pollitt, another terrible picture, emphasised the need for all data relevant to key advertising decisions to be properly analysed, complemented with new research and brought to bear on the judgments of creative strategy and how the campaign should be appraised. And both of those guys in their agencies invented this new discipline and created these people called account planners who were charged with that responsibility, applying good consumer research and critical control at every stage of advertising development. So by the time my book was published in '98, neither advertising nor the role of the account planner had really changed a whole lot. The agency world was still divided into above the line and below the line. You know, and above that imaginary line, when I got a brief, I had 5 choices: TV, radio, billboards, magazines, or newspapers. And below it, envelopes were pushed through letterboxes and shelf wobblers wobbled and telephones rang at dinner time. What a comforting world that was, and how simple. But from its humble beginnings, planning had spread all across the planet. but while some planners were now working on global brands and regional brands, the nature of the job was pretty much the same as it had always been. And I've always thought of it as this. It's about understanding and influencing the relationships between people in the real world and brands and media. And as an account planner in my early days, I was responsible for the media side of it as well. And I did work in combination with media specialists, but it was my job to understand people's relationships with brands, but also their relationships with media. So every touch point, how could we create relationships? So as a planner, I was a guide. I was an interpreter, leading clients and creative teams to the places where their actual or potential customers lived, shopped, used, watched, read, listened. And I provided them with the information and the language necessary to engage and influence those people. And I say engage and influence. No, engaging seems to be enough for a lot of people these days. I've always called me old-fashioned, but I think influencing's pretty important too. But throughout the process, I as a planner had to ensure that the work was saying the right things to the right people, and then once it ran, I was also responsible for monitoring its effectiveness in the marketplace. And it wasn't just a discipline, it wasn't just a skill that individuals or departments practiced, it was a philosophy. So Pollitt again talked about it representing a total agency management commitment to getting the advertising content right at all costs. As he went on, getting it right being more important than maximizing agency profits, more important than keeping clients happy, more important than agencies building a shop window for distinctive looking advertising. It means a commitment and a belief that you can only make thoroughly professional judgments about advertising content with some early indication of consumer response. And BMP lived and died by that philosophy. And I mean really lived and died by it. There were occasions where it took us 2 years from the point of briefing to getting a campaign up because it had to be right. You know, late but great was the agency's unofficial motto. Yeah, late and fired. But I trained there as a planner, and I lived and died by that philosophy too. And at Goodby Silverstein, we built a department and we built an agency on a commitment bordering on an obsession with getting it right. In America, patience was less. So, you know, we didn't extend to 2 years, but, you know, a few months, we would do everything we could to get it absolutely right. So, 30 years on, when I wrote that book, it represented an attempt to advocate that philosophy and to highlight the contribution that planning could make if all the agency, client, economic and cultural planets were properly aligned. But in the very year it was published, a lot of those planets were starting to shift off their axes. So in '98, Microsoft, then the world's most valuable company, released Windows 98. In Cupertino, California, Apple revealed the iMac. In Menlo Park and Palo Alto, Google and PayPal were founded. 98's remembered more for that than it is for my book, but anyway. But copies of my book could be purchased from what was then a 3-year-old company named Amazon.com. Before too long, a lot of them found their way to another 3-year-old company called eBay. But within 5 years, Apple had launched iTunes, Google had introduced AdWords, Facebook founded in 2004. And around that time, and this is why I'm telling this story about my book and the origins of planning, I got a call from another editor at John Wiley & Sons saying, we'd like you to write a second edition of Truth, Lies and Advertising. Because he said, with the rapid growth of e-commerce and of digital media and mobile stuff, and you must want to write about corresponding changes in the practice and philosophy of planning, right? And I said, no, I have no intention of writing that, because as far as I'm concerned, the most important things haven't changed. And I remain convinced about that today, and that's the theme that's going to run through much of what I have to say. Because I think that the basics of good communication, good planning, good marketing remain constant. And all of that other stuff is peripheral. It's tactical, it's executional around this core of strategy that remains exactly the same. So at its core, and this is how I continue to define my job, good marketing, good communication, and good planning is still about creating meaningful, productive connections between brands and humans. Our technological devices, our media habits, our attention span, they've all changed, although not as much as industry commentators would have us believe. but our fundamental nature hasn't. And as Bill Bernbach, founder of DDB, said many years ago, it took millions of years for man's instincts to develop, and it will take millions more for them to even vary. So, at risk of being considered a Luddite, which is what these gentlemen are, smashing up a machine in the Industrial Revolution, that's what I want to focus on today. All the industry and business headlines scream about change. They tell us that the future's interactive, digital, content-driven, mobile, social, programmatic, data-driven. Media fragmentation continues to accelerate. Our processes are increasingly complex. Big data's getting bigger all the time. New technologies assumed to be the answer before anyone's even asked the question. But as all of this happens, the further we seem to travel from the principles of humanity, simplicity, and common sense that have always characterized, for me, the best marketing, the best communications, and the best strategy. Now, all of you in this room occupy senior marketing positions, and I had a look at the guest list before a couple of days ago, and the words marketing, strategy, head of, director, chief, general manager, vice president were all fairly common themes on the sheet of paper. So I imagine, or at least I sincerely hope, that all of you have at least some influence in the companies that you represent. I'd like you to try and influence your companies, your agency relationships, your marketing strategy in some of the ways that I'm about to describe. And I say up front, none of them provide a silver bullet. Some of them are harder to achieve than others. Some of them are solid, tangible pieces of advice, others are softer, but I think no less significant. And even if you can do a couple of them and hold the line in a couple of these areas, it will make a difference. So there's an apocryphal saying, and this is Dwight, my cat, who has nothing whatsoever to do with what I'm about to say, but I always like to include him in a presentation. But there's an apocryphal saying that's, I'm sure you've all heard, Lord Leverhulme, John Wanamaker, it's been attributed to all of them. They say, I know that half of my advertising's wasted, I'm just not sure which half. And a lot of people in our business have sympathy with that point of view. It's apocryphal or not. The question is, which side of that statement do you sit on? Which side of that statement do any of us sit on? Is the glass half empty? It's full of fear and risk of failure? Or is it half full? If it's half empty, I do wonder how bad it can really be. As I have a colleague in London, Jeremy Bullmore, who's now in his 80s and still comes to work every day at WPP, but he writes an essay every year in WPP's annual report, and he wrote this year that in the 150-year history of mass media advertising, there is no recorded instance of an advertiser being brought to the brink of financial ruin solely because of a misguided advertising campaign. And he's right. Making movies is hazardous and unpredictable. Heaven's Gate nearly sent United Artists into bankruptcy. But with the possible exception of promotional campaigns, I don't know where you've budgeted for 500 winning bottle tops and for some reason 500,000 of them get printed. With the exception of that kind of thing, advertising campaigns never create disasters like Heaven's Gate created for United Artists. And reading that, I was thinking, when I came into the business, I think there was a general belief among clients and agencies alike in advertising's ability to shape and modify attitudes and behavior. People kind of looked on the bright side of what marketing communications could do for them. Advertising was seen as an opportunity. The prevailing mood of the industry, I think, was one of optimism. And with each brief, you'd get this sort of palpable sense of possibility based on a considerable body of evidence that's even more considerable today, that the right campaign can make a significant and tangible difference to the bottom line. But we live in different times, don't we? With increased competition and this it seems like an ever-present spectre of recession, we find ourselves in an era of accountability. The days of an agency acting as a kind of client consigliere, trusted advisor, partner, they're over. And in many cases, they've been replaced by this uneasy and almost alarmingly one-sided client-supplier relationship. And a lot of pitches aren't decided by client leaders of the kind who are represented in this room. They're decided by procurement people. It's very depressing. And the big brand building idea mentioned in the title, is increasingly and depressingly secondary to issues of efficiency. And I was recently asked at an industry conference, I was given a question that they wanted me to speak on, and the question was, is it better to get the campaign right or to be able to prove it? I said, what? No, you know, we're statistics crazy. I just as an aside, I was reading this article about last year's Oscars, and there was a company in the States predicted which film would win Best Picture, and they predicted with an 84% certainty that The Revenant would win Best Picture. And they boasted, we take the human element out and we just look at the data. So there was one of the leading betting companies in America said that Spotlight would win. And in spite of cognizant data analysis, giving it a 7% chance. And the betting company, after Spotlight won, were asked, well, how did you make that prediction? They said, we watched the movies. Anyway, so in a campaign AdMap seminar in London back in the 90s, there was a guy named Charles Channon, used to be Director of Studies at the IPA in the UK, and he drew what I think is a critical distinction between effectiveness, which you can define as doing the right thing, and efficiency, which is more about doing something the right way. And as he put it, an efficiency mindset allows a real world of difficult decisions and uncertain evidence to be turned into a comfortingly simplified one, where indices of performance are hard facts and acting on them will reduce risk as much as can ever be hoped for. He said this in 1990. Highly prescient. But the default process imposed by a lot of companies today doesn't represent an attempt to get things right. It's about avoiding getting them wrong. It makes a huge, huge difference. I think that's what's gone wrong with the Australian hockey teams at the Olympics, by the way. They're not having fun. They're not trying to win, they're trying not to lose. That's why they're out of the competition. Controversial. But I once heard a senior British police officer, he was interviewed on TV, and the interviewer was criticising him and his force for the reduction in the numbers of officers on the streets. And he responded, and he said, statistically, and it's always a worry when somebody answers a question and starts by using the word statistically, but he said, statistically, it's clear that since police officers have been taken away from the traditional beat, there have been more arrests. Well, I don't question his numbers. Yeah, he's probably right. There have been more arrests. And what he described might represent success against a government promise to increase the number of arrests. But does it represent increased effectiveness in his force's activities? I mean, I sit back and I think, well, when there were more officers on the street, surely they were a deterrent to crime. And the more you've got there, the less likely people are to commit crimes. Therefore, the less likely the arrests are going to be. But it's harder to reliably measure crimes that might have happened but didn't. So now the arrest figures are up and the government basks in its success and its efficiency, while all around the UK people are afraid to walk the streets of even the smallest towns at night. We're sacrificing the true objective, which is a safer society with less crime, all in the name of efficiency and accountability. And I think that's where a lot of problems start in our industry too. We're simply setting the wrong objectives. Now, doctors have a really nice way of separating things. They talk about presenting symptoms and underlying symptoms. And they see a patient who presents with a cough. Yes, they could treat the cough, but they might also look for underlying symptoms that might actually be nastier reasons why that patient has a cough and has had a cough for 3 months. And I see a lot of that in our business today. I get a lot of presenting symptoms from clients and not a lot of underlying symptoms. And the underlying reason is almost always harder to find. It's almost always harder to address, and it almost always takes a long time. Now, years ago, when I worked in the US, I worked on Porsche. And Porsche presented to our agency with a catastrophic sales decline. 40,000 cars a year down to 3,000 cars a year. I mean, that's a bad cough. Now, and they tried to find the underlying symptom. And when they came to us, they said, well, we know what our problem is. The problem is that people do not understand and appreciate the superior engineering of our vehicle. And they kind of banged their fists on the table as they said it. They do not understand. But we did a little investigation, and we thought, well, that actually can't be further from the truth, because everybody we spoke to who Porsche would have described as right on the money to be in their target market knew very well how well-engineered those cars were. They knew very well that they were race-bred, that they won more Le Mans than any other car manufacturer. And the reason people weren't buying them, we discovered, had nothing to do with that at all. And we talked to people they'd always wanted a sports car. They'd always believed that Porsche was the greatest sports car money could buy. They had the money to buy them, but they hadn't. And why hadn't they? Generally, the reason they hadn't is they didn't want to spend all that money on a car that made everyone else on the road think that they were a dickhead. So, as one respondent in a focus group put it highly succinctly, when I asked him what would go through his head when he was stopped at a light and looked across and there was a guy driving a 911 and you check each other out and what do you think? And I gave him a little cartoon thought bubble to fill in, and he wrote this. And very interestingly, as soon as he showed that to the rest of the group, everybody leaned forward. Everybody said, that is exactly what I wanted to say, but I thought you were paying me to be professional and say, professional things in research. But, that was it was a focus group, one of the most insightful things I've ever got out of research. And focus groups aren't done these days either, because they're unreliable, aren't they? And it's just 9 people sitting around talking about it. If you run them right, you can get good stuff out of them. But anyway, more on sensitive research in a minute. So, to come back to the original title of this, because I've been digressing for quite a while here, there's another reason why a lot of marketing's most pressing problems do remain unchallenged, and it's that it would simply take too long to address them. And in large part, I think this is a consequence of the shrinking life expectancy of chief marketing officers. So I'm told that the average tenure of a chief marketing officer today is about 2 years. Do we want me to stop now? Can we get the drinks? Yeah, there's bar. But here's what happens as a result. And I saw there was an article in America just a couple of weeks ago about the tenure is now lower than it's ever been. And is it because CMOs are promiscuous, or is it because they're considered less important or disposable? And I think probably the latter. But as a result, a lot of clients are briefing their agencies, and I've been on the agency side of this. They're briefing us to create work that affects something, anything, in the short term, to prove that they're making a difference, rather than address the more important issues that might take longer. And the thing is, why bother with a 5-year plan to build a brand when it won't even be your successor, but your successor's successor who gets to benefit from it? Nobody's going to do that. They're thinking about the next quarterly management meeting or the next round of quarterly result reporting. And the result's an avalanche of campaigns and briefs, and the objectives are based on what's easily measurable rather than what's right for the brand. And I'm afraid that we as agencies are accessories to the crime. If your margins, our margins are being squeezed too. They've been squeezed for a long time, and sometimes it's just easier to take the client brief and execute it, but we shouldn't, and we should push back. And you shouldn't give us the briefs in the first place. So when Martin Sorrell was in Sydney recently, he was interviewed by, I can't remember whether this was in the Australian or the Fin Review, and he was asked what he considered to be the biggest challenge to our industry today, and he answered, without skipping a beat, it's the short-term focus of clients. That's what he sees as his biggest enemy. Omnicom's not his enemy. Publicis isn't his enemy. His enemy is short-termism. And he talked in that interview about the things you mentioned, Sunita, about packaged goods companies in Australia investing more in trade promotion than branding, and building short-term volume but not building margin or premium or building a brand over the long term. And when I was talking about effectiveness versus efficiency, I used a phrase, big brand building idea, which used to be popular. But today it seems to be regarded much as one would regard using a rock and a stream to do your laundry. It's a thing of the past. And everywhere we look in our industry, we see fragmentation. fragmentation of ideas, fragmentation of budgets, even fragmentation of job titles. So when I was first hired by an agency in London, I was an account planner, and everybody who did what I did was called an account planner. Today, if you're a plain old account planner, you're like the last of the handloom weavers in the world of the spinning jenny. The cool kids all look like this, and they all rejoice in titles like insight planners and communication planners and channel planners and creative planners and strategic planners and brand planners, and if they're really cool, they're brand anthropologists or brand catalysts. and each of them's responsible for a really small slice of the brand, and a really small slice of understanding about the brand and the people who interact with it. So no one knows everything. It's like the army. I mean, the army gives everybody little jobs so nobody could possibly know enough to be dangerous, and that's what we've done in our agencies. Nobody knows enough to be useful. And I plead with you. I've always wanted to show a slide of a cowpat in a presentation, but don't buy the bullshit about the death of big ideas and traditional media. Were any of you here when Mark Ritson spoke recently? So I'm using less F words, but I mean, as he talked about, TV's still the dominant medium in Australia, or even among younger demographics, and it still kicks the arse of new technology, and radio does still reach 75% of Australians versus Facebook's 42%. Newspapers are still powerful. I mean, look at the Brexit campaign. Everybody was running social campaigns, and I'd see something on Facebook that talked about the lunacy of leaving Europe, and I'd share it with my friends, who, guess what, all think the same things I think, and if they don't, I defriend them. And we'd circulate it so the choir sang to the choir, and nobody made a blind bit of difference. And then the Sun ran a headline that said Independence Day, and 5 million people go, yeah, you know, foreigners go home. My parents were expecting the trucks to arrive on the Friday after the election and carry off all the polls. It's just, and it was new. The Daily Mail and the Sun influenced people more than any of our new media. And I mean, our industry should be, everybody who worked on that campaign should be taken out and shot because they failed miserably. And they failed miserably because they bought the bullshit about what works in modern communication, and they ignored the tried and tested traditional methods that in issues like that actually do make a difference. But we love shiny new things, don't we, in our industry? We all have this inbuilt fear of being seen as out of touch if we're not embracing them, and we're seduced by the technological possibilities of the digital world, but it's like dogs licking their balls. They do it because they can, not because they should, or because it's socially acceptable, or because it's right. I don't know where that came from. Anyway. Sorry, this is water. Anyway. But you add to that our obsession with measurability and short-term impact. And I recently was asked to judge the integrated category of an award show, and I watched 50 case history films, 55, something like that. A lot of them were interesting, and they were clever, and they were original. And I got to the end, and I realised that only 2 or 3 of them had mentioned any results that I would regard as legitimate measures of effectiveness. 2 or 3 out of 50 or more. It's shocking. More than 2 hours, I'd watched case histories that talked about thousands of tweets, unique media impressions, driving social engagement, creating a real buzz, starting a movement, likes on Facebook, trending hashtags, hot topic on social media, page views, video views, giving bloggers a reason to get excited. Over and over again, I'd been invited to join the conversation, follow us on Facebook, but why would I do that when you're a fucking hemorrhoid treatment? And I know, you know, a lot of you are sitting there probably thinking, he's so old-fashioned, it's irrelevant. But honestly, is it old-fashioned or irrelevant to expect effects from campaigns like usage frequency, or sales volume, or share, or margin? I think those are pretty good things to be aiming for. And I look at effectiveness. The Effies award campaigns year after year for making bloggers excited, and for likes on Facebook, and for starting movements. What happened to sales figures and share and profit? If the answer is social media, it must have been a bloody stupid question. And we have to go back to some of the basics. And that starts with taking a wider view of the world in which our brands exist. In our business, we spend a lot of time talking about insight, and I still get excited when somebody tells me they're about to reveal a great insight. And I'm almost always disappointed, because the great insight is often no more than an observation, some one-dimensional truth. You know, the population's aging. We're all obsessed with our phones. Young people are better with technology than old people. It's like, no shit, Sherlock. That's not an insight. And to me, a truly great insight exists at that place where a brand promise meets a broader cultural and a deeper human truth. So the Dove campaign is, I think, a good example of that, where the brand promise is about simplicity and honesty. And on its own, that might not be very interesting. But if you combine it with a deeper universal human insecurity about how we appear to others, and a broader cultural pressure on young women to conform to unattainable and airbrushed standards, then that becomes interesting and it becomes potent. And if you look at any great campaign, I bet that at its heart lies an active and mind-altering insight that uses real life experience and feeling and prejudice as its catalyst. And there's a lot of reasons why campaigns fall short, a lot of reasons why they might not succeed, but in my opinion, more often than not, they fail because their perspective, both in creation and in execution, is too narrow. And good example, when prosecutors failed to secure a conviction all those years ago for O.J. Simpson for the murder of his wife and her friend Ron, it was because they presented their case in the very narrow context of the crime. And they believed that the evidence would speak for itself, and they presented little bit of evidence by little bit of evidence in excruciating detail, one after another, day by day, week by week, for 28 weeks of presentation of their case. O.J. walked free because the defense attorneys succeeded in setting the crime and the charges leveled at an African-American man in the broader context of a story about racism in Los Angeles. And the defense story, their single big idea, resonated on a personal level with the African-American members of the jury who'd experienced racism in that city themselves or through people close to them, both generally in the city and specifically at the hands of the Los Angeles Police Department. And they just planted that seed of doubt that maybe, just maybe, a racist cop planted evidence on this poor innocent African-American man, and he walked away. And in the examples I've mentioned, taking the wider view means making connections between brands, crimes, elections, and real life. And the people who consistently succeed in making those kind of connections do so because they're compulsive collectors of experiences. When planners say to me, how do I become a good planner? I say, you've got to become a good collector. You've got to collect experiences. You've got to observe the world around you. You've got to listen to people speak. You've got to watch them shop and drink and dress and eat and ride and drive, not necessarily all at the same time. You've got to go to the places they go. You've got to listen to the music they're listening to. You've got to read the books they're reading, watch the programs, read the newspapers, see the same movies. You've got to become observers and consumers of life. And all the time, as one of these people, you should be adding to a physical or metaphorical scrapbook of stuff that might just be useful someday. I've got filing cabinets full of it in my office at home. At least I used to have filing cabinets full of it till I had 4 feet of water through my house just before I left the UK. That messed it up pretty badly. Now I have a version that's in the cloud somewhere and can't possibly be flooded, although I'm sure there's lots of other bad things that can happen to it. But what most important point is that you can't collect that kind of human and cultural experience and perspective from your desk. And one of the things that upsets me more than anything about planners today is I think we've got thousands of Google planners out there who never go any further than their desk and their laptop. They think that doing searches on their computer is the equivalent of doing research, and it's not. The insight on the Porsche campaign, I would never have found in a month of Sundays doing desk research. I had to go out and talk to people and stimulate them and provoke them to say the kind of things I needed them to say to answer that question, and I'll show you another example of that in a minute. But the best people in our business are interesting and interested, and that means spending a lot more time in the real world than it does spending time in their office. And they also shouldn't spend their entire time thinking about advertising or about marketing. People say to me, what's your favourite advertising campaign? I go, I don't know. I'm actually not very interested in advertising. I've worked in it for 30 years. You know, I think I'm pretty good at it, but I'm not fundamentally interested in it. What I'm interested in are all the things that happen around advertising that allow me to create better advertising. I'm not interested in marketing, but I'm really interested in the processes that I can apply to make somebody more successful at marketing. And it's a really, really important distinction. The reason David Ogilvy's up there smoking his pipe is that Jeff Goodby, who Sunita mentioned earlier, his first job as a copywriter, and by the way, he was a journalist turned copywriter. Most of the best people I've worked in the business have also worked in another business beforehand. So they've brought unique sort of problem-solving skills from another direction. Jeff was a journalist. First job as a copywriter was with Ogilvy and Mather in San Francisco, and the great man came to visit. So Jeff was like 25, and David Ogilvy walked into his office and said, "Hi, I'm David. How are you doing? What are you doing?" And Jeff burbled and babbled, and he was really nervous and told David how many hours he was working and how many campaigns he was writing and how important he thought it all was, and gosh, he was just never slept and David said, "No, hold on, cowboy," or something like that. I'm sure David wouldn't have said, "Hold on, cowboy," but he said, "I don't think you can write for 10 hours a day and have it be any good. Maybe 2 or 3 hours at most. The rest of the day should be devoted to making yourself interesting enough that we might actually want to read what you're writing." And I think that's one of the best pieces of advice I've ever heard from anybody in relation to our industry. And you need to encourage your people and your agency partners to get out and get a life in similar fashion. And there is another important reason why they should do that. And that has to do with the way the brain solves problems. So the subconscious, as you know, is the most powerful part of the brain, but in order for it to work, you need to switch it off. Now, tell me, any of you, where do you have your best ideas? Shower is always the first thing. In the shower, walking, somebody else said, driving. I have yet, when I've asked that question of thousands of people, I have yet to have somebody say, at my desk, in front of my laptop, or while pushing the buttons on my BlackBerry. It just doesn't happen. It's always somewhere where you're not being paid to have ideas. Now, this is Yallingup Beach in Western Australia. I spend a great many billable hours. I do. I shamelessly spend a great many billable hours on Yallingup Beach with my dog. And I do so because when I get back to my home after walking Fred on Yallingup Beach, I have generally solved the problems that I couldn't solve before I went for the walk. And do you know what? I haven't even thought about it. It's just by the time I get back to my desk, somehow I've got the answer. And it's because my subconscious has been working on it while I've been having it do something else. And in this procurement, billable hours, obsessed world, it's difficult, irresponsible even, isn't it? Criminal to be away from the desk and wasting time like that. But I say our first and most important responsibility is to our brands, and brands need our ideas. So if I do get away from my desk and by the end of the day I've solved a difficult problem, I think I've earned my money. And if it's your money, it's money well spent. The other reason why it's important to spend time in the real world rather than the office is to remind yourself you're in the business of creating communications for humans. And I'm sure that between all of you in this room, you've spent a fair bit over the years on segmentation studies, for example. I mean, wasted's a better word than spent, but they look good and they seem smart. They're ridiculous. I saw a study last week that divided shoppers into the fast and furious, those who are in a hurry, the here we go again people who don't like shopping, smart shoppers who take pride in their ability to shop, gourmet focused who are attracted to, yes, you've guessed it, higher quality products, variety seekers who seek variety, the budget conscious who are attracted to lower price items, and day out people who enjoy shopping and make it last. Who pays for this shit? Apart from the fact that we slice and dice our targets too finely, the kind of individuals described in these studies don't exist, or they exist at various times as all of the segments, depending on their circumstances or their mood. And Porsche had segmentation studies too, very expensive segmentation studies, but all of them focused on the people who might buy a Porsche, and they all missed the point that the group who needed to be affected by Porsche communication weren't the ones who might buy it. It was all the people around them who'd have an opinion about that purchase. No segmentation study on earth was going to get to that or help. And I could only get to that particular insight by having a conversation that led to one person in one focus group saying something that grounded all the electricity that had been rumbling around about how people don't really like Porsche drivers. So it has to be grounded. It has to be human. And that brings me to my last couple of points before Sunita starts drawing her finger across her throat.
Not even close.
She said she was going to. To be a successful marketer, you've also got to be able to develop and trust your instincts. You know, and a lot of us aren't allowed to do that these days. But I think that's why they pay you the big bucks, to have opinions and to make decisions. And I'd much rather work with marketers who make wrong decisions than marketers who don't make decisions at all. It's one of the reasons I respect Martin Sorrell as much as I do. He makes decisions, and he makes them quickly, he makes them decisively. If he gets them wrong, he admits he's got them wrong, but at least he's done it. Now, some of you may be familiar with this brand. They're not really this band. They're not my cup of tea. But over the last 6 years, I'm reliably informed that they've sold 50 million albums. Last year, they sold 2.5 million concert tickets, more than any other band in the world. What a lot of people don't remember is that this band came out of the X Factor in the UK. But what's most significant is they came third. They didn't win it, didn't even come second, they came third. So 10 million people who voted on the X Factor in Britain said they're no good. They're not as good as whoever did win, who we've now forgotten about. But Simon Cowell signed them. And he signed them because he thought they were going to be really good. He thought they were going to be really good. But he has a knack, he has an instinct for those sort of things. And our industry used to be full of people like that. People who had a knack or an instinct for knowing whether something was going to be right or not and following that instinct. Now, Akio Morita, who founded Sony, rejected market research that told him the Walkman wouldn't be a success. And he said at the time, people don't know what they want. It's our job to know what they will want and be there waiting for them. Yeah. Great definition of what we do best as marketers. Steve Jobs was cut from the same cloth. Nobody was asking for an iPod or an iPhone. He just knew that they'd kind of like it if he provided it. And 20 years ago, and I make reference, it's almost like we planned this. Remarkable. 20 years ago, a group of dairy owners in California decided that the money they were legally required to give to a national milk campaign wasn't benefiting them in any way. Milk sales in the US in general, California in particular, had been declining for 20 years. And no amount of advertising seemed to make a difference. But with that sort of glass half full mentality that I spoke about earlier, they got together and decided to fund their own campaign, in addition to what they were already paying to the national boards. This was money out of their pockets, and they said, we're going to give it 2 years, and we're going to create a campaign that's going to be better than the national campaign, and we're going to see if we can make a difference. And if we can't make a difference, we'll stop and stop wasting our money. If we can make a difference, we'll keep going. And they hired our agency to do it for them. And the first work we did, we came back with a simple observation, and we said that all the advertising for milk to us seemed to miss one very important point, that people aren't actually very interested in milk. Now, this is something that I don't think anybody had ever said to a group of milk people before. And it's a hard thing to say to the client, you know what, people really don't give a shit about your product. But in this case, it was absolutely true, they didn't. And all of those ads, and you've seen them, I mean, any country in the world I could talk about this, and people are familiar with all those ads with people jogging and dancing with milk cartons and singing to milk bottles and, you know, holding up those beautiful frosted glasses of milk and kind of doing, you know, they bore no relationship to the real world. They bore a lot of relationship to industry objectives, which was to bring more young people to milk and to, you know, to stop the aging of the milk profile and all that kind of thing. But no relationship to the real world. Truth is, milk's almost never consumed alone. And again, that's true in almost any country. In the US, it's much more likely to accompany something else like a chocolate chip cookie or brownies or peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. But it's always, the something else is always more interesting than the milk. And I mean, look, think of it, you don't pour yourself a bowl of milk and think, oh, what cereal shall I have in that today? No, it's true. But the something else always comes first, right? And it's always more interesting. So our hunch was that we could stimulate desire for milk through those companion foods. If you can get people to eat peanut butter and jelly sandwiches and brownies and chocolate chip cookies, then what else are they going to drink with it? Because they've got to drink something, and it's not going to be beer or orange juice or whatever. It's milk, companion food. So we also we thought we can stimulate desire for it through those foods, but we had to get people to buy more. It's not just about getting them to desire it; they have to buy it as well. And that's where the real insight lay. And that is, and this was revealed by research where again, I said earlier, you need to stimulate people in research. It's no good just going out with a blank sheet. You have to have a theory going in. And we got people to agree not to use milk for a week before they came to focus groups. So those focus groups were sort of really active things. And we said, we'll pay you an extra $25 if you don't use milk. And they all agreed because they thought an extra $25, great, easy, no glasses of milk. And then they realized during that week that actually what not using milk meant is not having cereal and not having your latte on the way to work. And they were kind of pissed off when they came to the groups. The $25 had not been worth it. And what became clear is that the only time you think about milk is when you haven't got any. And people talked about that week's experience of reminding them of all the times over history where they'd run out of it. And they'd gone to the fridge and they'd picked out the carton of milk and picked it up, and it's a little bit lighter than they thought it was going to be. And it's just this weird thing, you shake a carton of milk when it's lighter than you think it's going to be, as if by shaking it, more milk is going to appear in it, and it never does. It's so depressing. But anyway, that absence is much more keenly noted in the presence of those foods. So we created a campaign about not having milk, and I'm going to show you, because people don't do this anymore, I'm going to show you 2 TV commercials, pretty old school. Here we go.
And that was the Vienna Wood Dance, indeed, one of my all-time favorites. And now let's make that random call with today's $10,000 question. It's a tough one. Who shot Alexander Hamilton in that famous duel? All right, let's go to the phones and see who's out there.
Hello, for $10,000. Who shot? Excuse me? I'm afraid your time is almost up. I'm sorry that you're expected.
Good milk. Hey, Boopy.
I don't think so, Baldy.
So we launched the campaign with those 2 commercials, and they ran for 2 months at great expense, and absolutely nothing happened to change milk sales in California. Now, a lot of people, I think, would have pulled the plug a month in, 2 months in, but our marketing director told us that he remained convinced that it would work, that all the research that we'd done leading up to it had convinced him that just given enough time and given the presence of some of the elements that we still hadn't added to the campaign when it launched, like there was a lot of in-store stuff and things around stores. So in stores we got shelf talkers in the cookie aisle and the cereal aisle and so on, and checkout dividers that reminded people to get milk, and a lot of those little details. He said once the whole thing's there, we didn't know that there was such a thing as an integrated campaign at the time. But I'll tell you, that thing was it was 360. But he said, I believe in it, and he stood up in front of his board and said, I still believe that we're doing the right thing, just give it a bit longer, give it a bit longer. And after 3 months, for the first time in 2 decades, sales numbers in California didn't show a decline, they were flat. And the month after that, they went up, and every month for the next 24, there was an increase on the previous month. They reckon in the first year of the campaign, they made $80 million. They spent 25 they made an 80 beyond what they'd recouping what they'd spent. 20 years later, that campaign that they started off saying we'll only run it for 2 years, that campaign's still running, and it's still running because it's still making the dairymen more money than they're spending. And it's so important to stay with what you believe. Now, I'm just finishing now. If you're committed to understanding and influencing the relationships between people in the real world and brands and media, which I think is what you should be committed to as marketers, what I should be committed to with my advertising, then you've got to be optimistic that you have the power to make a difference. You've got to create a genuine culture of effectiveness in your company and insist upon it in your agencies. You must identify the real problems and tackle them, no matter how hard they seem or how long you think they're going to take. Don't be a quarterly marketer. Build brands. Create big and single-minded and motivating and sustainable ideas. Remember the basics. Don't be distracted by the shiny new stuff. Remember to fit our brands into people's lives, not to try to force people's lives into our brands. And we're only going to understand those lives if we go to them, if we get out more. We need to understand them as humans, not artificial categories, and we need to use our experience to inform decisions. And once we've made them, we've got to stick to them. So, thank you.